think the main thing that I've learned is that no matter, how much you know, and, I've got an MBA and a good background in a lot of things like finance and marketing and all of that, HR. It's not really so much how much you know, but what your relationships are with other people.
That was Janet Jernigan. Janet has won countless awards in her life. Her more than 50-year career as a nonprofit leader is legendary, as are the records she currently holds as an athlete. However, her true advocacy for others may be rooted in the mid-'60s, when as a student at Vanderbilt, she began to advocate for equality by playing a role in the 1960s civil rights movement in Nashville. Her tenacity as a nonprofit leader, advocacy for others, and fierce determination in running and in triathlons is legendary. Let's hear how this remarkable woman finds time to care for herself and for others in this Squeeze the Day.
I'm Sally Hussey, the CEO of 50 Forward, and we elected to launch this podcast because we know older adults have such inspiring stories and wisdom worth sharing. We have now all learned that social connections are critical to our well-being. This podcast is made possible by 50 Forward, the leading resource for adults 50 plus in Middle Tennessee who seek to live longer, more fulfilling lives.
You're listening to Squeeze the Day, where we talk to extraordinary people over the age of 50 who are living their best life now. Their stories of a well-lived life are both inspiring and encouraging to all of us as we seek to navigate a meaningful and purpose-driven second chapter in our life. Today's Squeeze the Day is brought to you by the All of Us Research Program from the National Institutes of Health. Learn how you can help change the future of health by participating in the program. Visit www.joinallofus.org to learn more. I'm Susan Sizemore, Communications Director for 50 Forward, so let's get started. Janet, welcome.
Hello.
You're a tireless advocate for others. I'm wondering if some of your nonprofit leadership may have been grounded in your advocacy for civil rights in the 1960s. Will you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think mainly a lot of my leadership experiences really started through the United Methodist Church. I was an officer in the district United Methodist and also the Tennessee Conference United Methodist. I was actually chair of Christian social concerns, and at the time we were mainly concerned about alcohol and sex, and I was for one and against the other, but I decided that we really needed to focus more that a real social issue at that time was segregation. And so when we were officers, several of us who were still in the community who were active in the Methodist Church became more involved in the civil rights movement. My father also was involved in the Ministers' March. So, I just kind of grew up headed toward that direction. I think the main thing leadership-wise in the civil rights movement was just my interest in having meetings that stuck to the point and stayed on topic, because I was really terrified that somebody would blow up the church where we met, which was over in North Nashville, was an AME church, and that's where we met to plan the integration of the Cross Keys restaurant. So that's my main thing coming out of that was just, I just like people to get to the point, say what they have to say, and then go on about our business.
So interesting. I feel like we worked together for a number of years, and we've talked a lot about some of the early lunch counter sit-ins and advocacy here in the Nashville area. And until I did some research on you, I really didn't know that you had played an active role in that too, which does not surprise me. But I felt like it was another part of your life and chapter that we hadn't heard.
Well, I think one thing I learned really after I retired, that so much while I was working, I was just strictly focused on the job that needed to be done. And I probably didn't take as much time as I needed to find out about the lives of other people and staff that I worked with. So that's the nice thing about retirement. I can really appreciate more about other parts of other people.
Tell us a little bit about your roots as a native Nashvilleian.
Well, see, my mother and father both came originally from Alabama. My mother's father was an Episcopalian minister. She always felt like she was on display as a minister's daughter, and she said one thing she would never do is marry a minister, and she met my father, and he was a sports writer for the Anniston Times. Shortly after that, he decided to come to Vanderbilt to go to divinity school. So fortunately for their marriage, he always was in writing and worked for the national Methodist agencies that are based here in Nashville. But, I grew up in South Nashville. Actually, we lived most of the time on the corner of Outer Drive and Evans Road. I was a real tomboy. I was the largest kid and the oldest kid in the neighborhood and kind of headed up a gang of young boys, and we did all the things we liked to do. We played baseball, we played cops and robbers. Where we lived was right near the old Glendale trolley line, so we would go through there in the woods and hunt Indian feathers and all that kind of thing. And I was working with someone back at Centerstone, and she was telling me, one of the other staff people, that she had just moved to Outer Drive. And I said, well, Craig Ann, I actually lived at the corner of Outer Drive and Evans Road. About 2 weeks later, she said to me, I had a friend over who I won't name, who's an attorney, and we were talking, and he said, Craig Ann, I lived at the corner of Evans Road and Outer Drive. And she said, well, my goodness, my boss lived at the corner of Evans Road and Outer Drive. And he said, I know, that's a big kid that used to beat me up all the time. So it gets worse. That time that I had the AWA award, and I had the remark in the video about when they asked me how did I feel when I received the Academy of Achievement Award, and I said, well, I'm not really sure if what psychologists say is true, but they say that if a person receives an award they really don't feel like they deserve, they go out and, they do something that's out of character just to prove to themselves that they didn't deserve it. And I said, I don't know whether that's true or not, but ever since I heard about this award, I've had the overwhelming desire to rob a liquor store. So I'm leaving the ballroom that night after the interview, and this woman comes up to me, and she introduces herself, and she's this attorney's wife. And she said, I've heard about you for years. And she said, my husband's always said he wasn't messing with you, and I just want you to know after that remark, I'm not messing with you either. So that's one thing about living in a community and growing up in a community. People know a lot about you that maybe sometimes you wish they wouldn't. On the other hand, you have a lot of contacts with people that you can go back to who are longtime friends, and that's always been helpful too.
Speaking of your roots and being a tomboy, and I know throughout your life you've really maintained athleticism as being a priority, that, competing and being an athlete is super important, and I know you've competed in the Senior Olympics. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, let's see, you're eligible to start in the Senior Olympics when you get to be 50 years old, and I really didn't hear about it until I think I was 52, so I've been involved and active for 25 years or so now, and the most wonderful thing about it is you meet all sorts of people. One of the very first experiences was as a woman who was 100 years old who actually celebrated her 100th birthday on the track. And that was just really inspirational to me. So I've been involved in Senior Olympics both at the district and the state and the national level. And now I pretty much help them some with their fundraising and, hope to support other athletes as they come along.
To be inspired by a runner at the age of 100, it's truly amazing. And I want to talk a little bit about friendly rivalry, too, because I know you've got a friendly rivalry with Marge Stoll, and I want you to share a bit about that and kind of the barriers maybe that you two are breaking together and then independent of one another.
Well, I met Margie probably between 15 and 20 years ago, and we were in a track event. I didn't know her, and she's actually 3 years older than I am, but the way the age groups go every 5 years, for 2 years, we have to compete against each other. So this very first time, we were on the track, and I was flying along, and there was this woman just right on my heels, and I just barely crossed the line before she did. So I turned around, I introduced myself, and I asked her how long she'd been running, and she said 6 months. I said, 6 months? Here, I've been running almost 30 years at the time. I said, you are really, really talented. So I guess that inspired her. She hired a coach, and then that was about the last time I ever came in ahead of Margie until I guess recently she started to slow down on the longer events like the half marathons. So the last couple of half marathons where we ran against each other, I came ahead in 15Ks. But Margie recently went to the National Senior Olympics in Fort Lauderdale, and I had planned to go, but I decided just with caregiving for my husband and it would need to be gone for 10 days, it just wasn't logistically going to work out for me. So Margie had emailed and let me know what her flight number was and all of that and where she was staying and so forth, and I had to get back in touch with her. And I said, well, Margie, I've decided I can't go. And she really understood because she was a caregiver for her husband, Hans, before he died. And she said, well, I'm just really sorry. I understand. And I said, well, I'm really looking forward to this, and I always like to have goals. And I've decided, since I'm not going to compete and have goals in the National Senior Olympics this year, I've noticed that your state record for the 15K at 78 years old, I believe I can break that. So I'm going after your state record. So she emailed me back and she said, go for it. So she's a great person. At the Senior Olympics, the state level is pretty low budget. So all they ever are able to furnish is water after the events. But after the 5K and the 10K, every year Margie always brings like fig bars and those nutty butters and chocolate raisin cookies and grapes and cherries and bananas and furnishes that for all the runners, which is very generous, and she's done it for several years. But, I think Margie's been a great role model. She's very encouraging of other people. And, running's really changed over the years. A lot of people like Margie got into it later in life. And some of us got into it really when the running boom went on. So I think probably I've been competing longer than any other woman right now in Middle Tennessee, except Linda DePaulis, my friend, and she started a year before I did.
The camaraderie, A, must be amazing. And then B, I know you've talked some about it's a stress reliever as well, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely.
So running isn't all you do. I mean, and I don't want to say all because you do that to such a great extent, but you're also a triathlete. So why don't you talk a little bit about those skills too, because bike riding and swimming too are other components of a triathlete's competition.
Well, I got into the triathlons when I turned 40 because I thought 40 was a big, crisis kind of midpoint birthday. Little did I know how young 40 is now,
Right.
But that's how I got into doing the triathlons. And I had my good friend Susan, actually, that I started running with. She and I started doing triathlons together, and primarily, we do the sprint distance ones, which are usually 5K, 3.1 mile run, and then usually about 26 miles on the bike, and then a quarter or half mile swim.
So tell us a little bit about your love and work with horses. I know that you're also an equestrian at some level and that horsing is part of your world. So share a bit about that.
Well, when I was growing up, my grandparents still lived in Alabama, and my grandmother always felt like I needed a little more socialization because my parents just kind of let me run wild. And she'd have us come down in the summertime, and she could stand it for about 2 days, and then she would send my sister and me off to a private girls' camp. And they had horseback riding. So from the time I was 6 years old, I was able to ride horses at the camp where we went. And after a while, I was like a junior counselor and would kind of help take care of the horses and so forth. And then when I got to be about in the 7th grade, we moved over to Overbrook Court, which was back right up to Glenlevin and the Curtiswood area in Nashville. And all those homes had pastures, horse pastures in their back of it. And I kept saying, I want a horse, I want a horse. Well, my parents weren't about to get a horse. But there was a kid in the neighborhood who had a horse, but he only rode it about once a year. And then when he did, the horse was just so unmanageable, So I just didn't want to even ride. And so I went to his mother and worked out a deal. If I would feed the horse and ride it regularly if I could do that, and she let me do it. So I had a horse that really I didn't have to feed and pay for, and was able to ride with my other friends primarily all through the 7th and 8th grade. And then when I met my husband, he had a horse, and he always says that I married him for his horse, and that's not true, but it wasn't, too bad that he had one. But when we got married, actually, rather than an engagement ring, he bought a bay filly that had a diamond in the middle of her forehead, which is really a romantic story, but about 2 years later, we got offered a profit, and so we sold her and turned around and bought her mother. But we've always had horses since then. We did a lot of showing, particularly in both of the spotted saddle horse associations. The main horse that we loved, her name was Jan's Joyride, and we trained her ourselves. She was the only horse that we were the only people who had ever been on her back. And so we thought she was really talented. So we took her when she was 3 years old out to Manchester to show, and she'd acted okay on the farm. We got out there, and I was riding around in the ring, and there was smoke coming out of the concession stand. And every time we'd come around the ring and she'd see that smoke, she'd run sideways. It was really a mess. I think, oh, just good Lord, just let me out of this ring. So finally, as we were going out after she came in last, the announcer says, doesn't look like Joyride's been off the farm before. So, but we knew she was talented. So my husband always said he was never going to ride in the ring. He wasn't making a fool of himself. But I talked him in for us working with her and for him riding her the next time. So about 2 months later, we thought she was ready, and we went to a horse in Shelbyville, and he was riding, and there were like 18 in the class, and she came in second, and people couldn't believe the improvement in the horse. And then after that, she was pretty well adjusted to the ring, and she won all kinds of ribbons, and she died fairly young suddenly when she was 10, but they put her in the Spotted Saddle Horse Hall of Fame, and she was the first mare, as far as I know, and I think the first amateur-owned and trained horse that was in the Hall of Fame. So she was a really, really good horse. She would usually be eligible to be shown in 4 classes at most of the shows, and he would ride in a couple, and then I would ride in a couple.
How nice. That's really an interesting story. So tell us about some of the lessons you've learned in nonprofit, because I know that's been really near and dear to you, and the nonprofit world has certainly changed in the landscape over the years.
Well, it has. I think the main thing that I've learned is that no matter how much and I've got an MBA and a good background in a lot of things like finance and marketing and all of that, HR. It's not really so much how much you know, but what your relationships are with other people. So I think the main thing I've learned in nonprofit is that when you're in a leadership position, one of the most important things you need to do is really have a good relationship with the board of directors. And I know many times over the years I had colleagues who would lose their jobs, and it was almost always because they got into some sort of conflict with their board of directors. So recommend anybody in nonprofit really to focus on not only the relationships with the board of directors, but with all the staff people and volunteers and other people that you serve too, because that's really the main thing. And I think also that to accomplish really significant, important goals, you need to do that as a team effort and to work with people who are focused on the same goal that you are. And that's another one of the most rewarding things, to see so many things accomplished, and the fact that you were able to work with other people to make that happen.
So you've had 5 decades of leadership service, and I'm curious, as a woman in business, what changes have you experienced over that time?
Well, I was thinking back, I've always been pretty much in supervisory positions. When I graduated from college, I had intended, just because I had a young baby, that I would work for the school system and teach, and that way I'd be off in the summers, and I wasn't really thinking too much beyond that. And I went in for an interview, and they were about ready to hire me, and they noticed that my son was less than 6 months old, and they said, "Oh, we have a rule that you can't work if you have a child less than 6 months old." I don't think they have that kind of rule anymore, but I had worked in the summer times at Middle Tennessee Mental Health Institute. So I started out there, and they had a position for the supervisor of the occupational therapy department. I didn't really know anything about it, but I learned, and after about 3 years, the director of the adjunctive therapy department, who was a man, and that supervised all the different therapies like recreation therapy and several of the different ones that we had, occupational therapy and all the therapies that went on there. And he left, and so I thought, well, I could do that job. And so I was getting ready to go back to graduate school. And so I had the summer between that time, and I went to the superintendent of the hospital, and I said, I'd love to do that job. Just give me a chance for 3 months, and we're going to do this. We're going to start a camping program, and we're going to start a domestic science program and all that. And Dr. Trailblazer said, well, Rome wasn't built in a day. And I said, no, I figure it's going to take me at least 2 weeks. So I went into that position pretty cocky. And at the time, there were a lot of psychiatrists that worked there at the hospital. It was a very male-dominated kind of situation. And when you get a lot of men, and especially if they're psychiatrists, you just can't imagine how that goes. And there was one psychiatrist, I won't name him, he may have living relative still, but he had this expression. He had a big beard, but he had this saying that he always would say that he thought was so clever. He'd say, well, I was thinking this morning while I was shaving. So, I met with him one time to talk about referrals for a program that we had started. And he said, well, why don't you relax and put your feet up? And I thought he was kind of creepy, and I kind of entered the interviews or time with him as quickly as I could. But we got in a full staff meeting not too long after that. And he said, well, Ms. Jernigan, I was thinking, because at the time my husband was in charge of the recreation program, which meant that I was his supervisor at work. In front of everybody, he says, well, Ms. Jernigan, I was just thinking this morning while I was shaving that at home your husband wears the pants and at work you wear the pants. And I said, well, perhaps you need to do a little more shaving and a little less thinking. And so that kind of got around the hospital. And I don't know, I just started getting a reputation for I had another issue with a psychiatrist that was always having a couple of our staff people. He had to go to his milieu therapy meetings, and they never could come help clean the pool or do anything. And he was telling people no need to refer to our domestic science program that I had started because I'd be leaving in the fall. And, I just decided it was time for a chat with him. And I went over and met with him, and he had his whole team laid out there, including the chaplain. And here I was on the other side of the table. And finally, after going back and forth, me trying to tell him that I had to have those staff people doing other things, they could not devote their whole, work experience to what he needed them to do. And I finally said, well, we just, I don't understand what your challenges are, and you don't understand mine. So why don't we just change jobs for a week? The head nurse says, oh, Dr. So-and-so can't do that. And he said, I think that's a good idea. And the head nurse says, oh, this is the most creative thing I ever heard. But so we did. I followed him around for a week, and except I'd get out on the wards and we wasn't looking, I'd go back and do my job. But then when his week came, I had him playing basketball and helping clean the pool and all of that. And after we did that, we had our domestic science folks pick this big dinner. And so, he came and I came, and we turned out to be really good buddies. But, it just kind of went from there. I guess one of the things with me being a woman in business, I think, was just growing up as a tomboy, and mostly when I was a young age, most of my friends were boys, so men never really did much intimidate me because I kind of know how they all started out.
What's your greatest advice for women today in the workplace?
I think the main thing is that you need to have other people as resources, whatever it is you might need to know or experiences that you don't have, to find somebody who knows more about it than you do. The role of mentors is really important. It was really important for me, and early on. But by the time I was mid-career, or really in my early 30s, Molly Todd, she's the one who really should be credited with the whole approval of metropolitan government in Nashville. When it first came up for vote, it was not approved. It was turned down, and at the time she was really active in the League of Women Voters, and she did a real organized door-to-door campaign. She was really active in the legislature. She and I headed up a forum when Reagan came into office and a lot of the social programs were starting to be discontinued. She would always tell me, get to know their secretaries, whoever the gatekeeper is. I learned a lot from working with the legislature with Molly, and then I was very fortunate later in my 40s, and he was in the late 70s and early 80s. Jack Massey was volunteer chair of a capital campaign we had at Outlook Nashville, and Jack was a tremendous mentor for me. He was always giving me advice. Sometimes I would say, "Oh, Jack, I know that." I remember one time he called me, and a friend of his had donated some stock to the capital campaign, and Jack says, "Now, Janet, you always sell stock when you get stock donated." And I said, "Oh, I know that, Jack." I said, "Ms. Frist Sr. just gave us some stock, HCA stock, and we sold that immediately." He said, "You idiot." She said, "I don't mean in every case," because, of course, Jack was the founder of HCA along with Dr. Frist Sr. But he was a good one. And just other people all through my career. After Molly died, of course, a great mentor, someone who taught me a lot too, was Charlie Cardwell, particularly in dealing with government and all those kinds of issues. So that's the most important thing. You really need to know people who can help you out and who know more than you do and can impart that knowledge.
So interesting, some of the names that you've brought up. And now I want to talk a little bit about retirement, because you've retired, and a lot of people in retirement don't continue to stay involved in the community. But I know that you are definitely very much still involved. And I'm wondering why community and community engagement are so important to you.
Well, I think it just always goes back to when I was thinking of the top 10 decisions I made in my life. I think really early on, I just decided I was going to be the very best person that God created me to be, and that just really meant being as fortunate I was to be able to help other people in whatever capacities. So I just like to be involved and help out. I still work a good bit with Leadership Nashville. Joyce Searcy and I have a session that we've been doing now probably for 20 years, once a year with that. I help with the Tennessee Senior Olympics. Girls on the Run is another organization. So mostly I support more financially now than time-wise with the organizations that I'm particularly interested in.
So looking back at your career, are there certain instances that really stand apart as some of your most rewarding moments?
Well, particularly at 50 Forward, I remember one of the most beautiful things I thought early on. We used to have a huge Friday night dance, and we had our own orchestra. And at Valentine's, they would always elect a king and queen, and there were two folks, an older couple, Ruby and Leroy Parrish, who were in charge of the dance. But that year, they got elected the king and queen. I just will never forget them dancing to Tennessee Waltz. It was just absolutely beautiful. But so many of the special events that we did meant a lot to me. You got to meet a lot of people and have a lot of people involved. The College Grove golf tournament, Katie Reed golf tournament, was always fun to do. I'd go every year and volunteer for that, and we'd get set up with all the food and all while they were still golfing, and then they'd all the golfers would come through the line. And the first year I did that, I guess I was handing out the barbecue, but Fran Mazzaferro, who had been the associate director, was big into portion control, and she had trained me back in portion control for the cafeteria at the Knowles Center. So, I was kind of scooping it out like we would when the cafeteria was selling, where we'd make money. And so evidently the golfers complained to the other volunteers that I wasn't putting enough barbecue on their buns. So after that, the volunteers would never let me do anything but pass out the buns. I couldn't convince them that I had changed, that I knew, just let the people tell me how much they wanted. And all that time, I never got to do anything other than hand out the buns after that. But, just a lot of different experiences. Certainly the Capitol campaign we had with the grand openings of the 50 Forward Martin Center and the center with the MCA in Bellevue and the Patricia Hart Building, and then the Madison Station early on. So a lot of good times.
Let's talk a little bit about caregiving. You've touched on it a couple times in this interview, and I know that you've had to care or worked to support and find care for different family members, your mother included, and your husband. And I just am curious, there might be some lessons maybe that you can share with us to help others when they're in that same situation.
Well, I think the main thing, I was really fortunate when I worked in the mental health field fairly early on. One of my colleagues asked me if I would do a stress management class that he was giving. And so I agreed to do it. I had to read all up on it and all of that. And so I think once you start to do one class or seminar or something, you're supposed to be an expert. And so I did a lot of seminars and classes on stress management. And then I got into time management and just read everything I could and tried to apply what I learned. What I know for sure with caregivers, and I observed it many times, particularly when I was at Outlook Nashville, when we worked with children and adults with really pretty serious disabilities, that many times the parents just were absolutely worn out, burned out, just were not taking care of themselves, either physically or mentally. And that's certainly true, too, of caregivers. And I've done a few caregiving sessions where the last session really was on self-care. But it's just very hard a lot of times for people to realize that they have to get away, they have to do something different. I have the ideal situation really for caregiving because I can just go right outside the door and I can climb up to the top of a big hill where I have a park bench and I can just sit and admire all the beauty around me, or I can go out and swim, or I go out and run, or whatever I need to do. But people have just got to learn to take care of themselves physically and mentally. And, if you don't do that, you're not going to live long. One thing I learned in all the stress management research was that, ordinarily when a spouse dies, then 6 months later, the spouse is going to die or get seriously ill. There are just so many correlations between stress and so many other diseases. So that is my best advice for caregiving. The other thing is keep a sense of humor. It's really fortunate for me that both my mother and my husband would say some of the funniest things. I think one of the most recent things, my husband doesn't do as much of sundowning as he used to, but, he'd get on this kick, particularly after supper. Let's go home, and I'll be real patient, and I'll say, we are home, and we're here, and I'm your wife, and you're my husband. And so a couple of months ago, he just wouldn't let it go, and we'd go on and on for about 30 minutes. I want to go home. And so finally, I wanted to watch something on TV, and I was getting out of patience. I've been telling him, and he'd say, no, you're just telling me that. Why are you telling me we're home? And so finally, I just said, look, we're at home. We live here. You just need to relax and be happy. And he said, how can I be happy when I'm married to a crazy person? The first time I took him to the neurologist, the nurse says to him, she said, who's this with you? And he said, that's my wife. And she said, how many years? And he said, I don't know, but she's getting pretty old. So wow. It's something like that all the time.
I do think a sense of humor just can guide so many of us through many difficult circumstances in life. There are a couple questions that we ask everyone when they're guests of the podcast, and one relates to a piece of advice that a parent or an older adult might have given you when you were young, but now today it rings true in your everyday life as being something that's super important.
Well, it was hard for me to think of anything, but then I was thinking back when I was in high school, I was real active in dramatics, and I got the thespian medal when I graduated from high school, but I always played the support parts like the old maid aunt or something like that. And so we came to our senior play, and I thought, well, I want to have the lead. So I thought, well, I'm going to go talk to the English teacher who was our dramatics sponsor. Her name was Miss Thaxton. And I told her, I said, I would really like the lead in our senior play. She says, oh, no, she said, we're going to need to have somebody that's, really, don't want to hurt your feelings, but somebody a little bit more feminine and somebody kind of blonde-headed and blue-eyed. And at the time, I had this blouse on that had little lace strips down. I thought I really looked good. I love that blouse. And she said, and while I'm on it, I want to tell you, you don't need to dress like that. You're destined to be a businesswoman, and you need to be wearing business suits now as you go on in through life. And so she said, that lace, you don't need to wear any lace. So I thought, well, that is just absolutely the silliest advice that I ever got. But I thought, so I didn't wear any more lace. And so I went on through school and graduate school, and I was working at Centerstone, and I went out shopping one Sunday, and there was this beautiful blouse, and it had just a little small lace strips down the blouse and had a little small thin ribbon bow. And I thought, well, I'm just going to buy that blouse because that's a beautiful blouse and I want to wear it. So I go in on Monday wearing my beautiful blouse and nice black flared skirt and black sandals, and I'm coming down the steps, and my boss, who's the executive director of Centerstone at the time, is coming up, and he just stops and just looks in sheer terror, horror. And I said, what seems to be your problem? And he says, well, you look so frilly. And he said, you're just not a frilly person. So that was the last of the lace. So I guess that was good advice, that don't be wearing lace. And so now I don't.
Wow. Those things in our youth set us up for adulthood, that's for sure. What is it that you do, Janet, to squeeze the day?
Well, I'll tell you, way back, Beverly Grant had written an article in the 50 Forward newspaper at the time, and she said in 2004, resolved to count 2004 blessings. So I divided that up, and it was like 5 or 6 a day. And so every night for a long time before I'd go to sleep, I'd just count my blessings. And then I read Dr. Sanjay Gupta's book, which is Keep Sharp, How to Build a Better Brain at Any Age. And he recommended one of the many things. He's got kind of a 12-week program, but one of the things he recommends is to have a gratitude journal. And so I do that regularly every evening. I'll just write out 5 things that I'm really grateful for. And what it does, it helps you really realize what the things are that are important to you in life. And I just make sure that those things are things that I continue to include in what I do. The other thing to squeeze a day is I also am pretty goal-driven, so I generally will have like a plan for the week of things that I really plan to accomplish and get done.
I love all of those things, and the gratitude journal especially. I'm hoping that when people listen to this, they pick up on some of these nuggets and carry them forward because they're super important, but also can be life-changing. I want to thank you for joining us today. What an amazing life of leadership we're witnessing from interviews and stories just like yours. Now we challenge everyone listening to go squeeze the day.